So I want to talk about the ways of silencing whistleblowers and give some of my personal experience. And we have libel and slander laws, which I'm from the UK, as you can tell, and we have the stiffest slander and libel laws in the world, I think, which is why lots of people travel to the UK to sue people, even if the so-called libel hasn't been in the UK. But of course, the disciplinary actions and dismissal, as Peter knows about, and gagging contracts. And the big weapon they have is the inequality of arms, as lawyers say, the difference in the money you have to defend yourself and the money that a pharmaceutical company or an employer has to prosecute you. And also the slowness of the legal process helps those silence whistleblowers, because if you're held up in a legal case for several years, it's the whole of your life really for those years, whereas a company can just delegate a couple of people to dealing with that and pay their lawyers to deal with it. So it's the length and the inequality of arms. And the libel laws prevent retraction of fraudulent articles. They prevent universities withdrawing degrees gained dishonestly. And the best example I know is the Master of Surgery degree of A.K. Banerjee. It took 24 years for me to get that withdrawn, even though the university knew it was entirely fraudulent. Researchers questioning it stops researchers questioning false claims of commercial interests and exposing misconduct in general. And my story started in the 1980s when I was a cardiac research fellow, and I was working on a drug called amrinone, which it was helped would improve the treatment of heart failure. And I found it was ineffective, but had horrific side effects. And the company that made it, Sterling Winthrop, now part of Sanofi, wanted me to, initially they wanted me just to alter the data. They asked me to leave out some of the data points. And when a drug does not increase contractility, you don't see all the lines going across. What you see in a biological system is a few go up and a few go down, and statistically there's no difference. And they wanted me to take out all the ones that went down, leaving only the ones that went up, which would have given a statistically significant improvement. And I said I couldn't do that. So they then offered me the equivalent of 2 years' salary not to publish at all. And then when I said that I had to publish, they threatened me with legal action. And then we did publish. And after I published about the side effects of the drugs, which were horrific, it produced thrombocytopenia in 50% of patients given the drug for a week. It produced eosinophilia, polyserositis, intractable vomiting, and it increased mortality by 30%. So it wasn't they weren't really onto a winner. But I published the side effects of the drugs, and 10 days later I was contacted by Dr. Offerhaus from the Netherlands Committee for the Evaluation of Medicine. He said, I don't understand your data, your side effect data. I've got your clinical records forms and these side effects are not on them. And I said, well, they are. And he and I compared my imprint copies of my clinical records forms and what the company had submitted, and they had submitted forgeries, removing most of the side effects. And so the drug was banned in Europe. And then in 1984, the company told the FDA that in the first 1,200 patients given the drug, there were over 1,400 life-threatening side effects, so more than one per patient on average, and they were withdrawing the drug worldwide. But 2 years later, I discovered that this drug that you could no longer get on a doctor's prescription in Europe or North America, you could buy over the counter in parts of Africa and Asia, because the company were marketing it despite knowing that it increased mortality by 30%. So I went to Oxfam and asked them, to use their representatives in various African and Asian countries to buy the drug, get proof of purchase, and we took it to the WHO in Geneva and got the drug withdrawn worldwide by embarrassing the company. I then went to the British Medical Journal, Lancet and Nature, and asked them to describe what had happened, report what had happened. And they all gave me very nice lunches, but they all said they couldn't take on a pharmaceutical company because they didn't have enough money to combat them. So I went to the Guardian newspaper in the UK, and they published about it on the front page, the back page, and the whole of an inside page, and on subsequent stories, because their lawyers said there would be no problem defending an action. Well, I then became more and more interested in research fraud, and then Richard Horton at The Lancet asked me to write an article about it after I'd spoken at a meeting in 1996. He asked me to write about the code of silence that kept people reporting misconduct. And you'll see at the bottom the footnote here. It says, documentary evidence corroborating Dr. Wilmshurst's article was made available to The Lancet. Now, most of my articles about misconduct have something like that at the bottom. Journals will publish my research articles. I'm a cardiologist. I write articles about treatments, and they have implications for survival of patients. And no journal has ever asked me to produce evidence that I got those results. They've never asked to see the data. But in this case, I had to go through the article sentence by sentence with Richard Horton, checking the document to make sure that what I said was correct. And that was the first time that King's College London threatened me with a libel action because I pointed out they'd concealed research fraud for a decade. First of 3 times and I reported 2 of the people I described in this article. I reported a number of them actually to the General Medical Council, but the first 2 to come up were A.K. Banerjee and his boss, Professor Tim Peters. And they were at King's, and they were found guilty by our regulator, the General Medical Council, of serious professional misconduct, the highest sanctionable finding, for falsifying research for a decade. And the important thing was that King's had known for a decade, they'd had an inquiry, and their response was to destroy the evidence and silence the whistleblowers. I wrote about this in the BMJ in this article, Institutional Corruption in Medicine, and it's important to realize that Professor Peters was not only the head of a department, he was the Associate Dean for postgraduates and higher degrees. So it is for London University, so it's particularly relevant that his student had falsified his higher degree. And Peters was aware of it and had let him submit it even though it was entirely made up. Now, if you want to look this up, you won't be able to see it on the BMJ's website. Oh, sorry, because the BMJ, although I should say that they also put this statement, documentary evidence corroborating this article was made available to the BMJ, and their lawyers okayed it, but then King's threatened legal action the second time. And then the BMJ agreed to take it off their website. And if you read this, if you go to the BMJ's website, you'll see that this article has not been retracted, but for legal reasons has been withdrawn from the website. So it's true, but you can't see it. So when I wrote about this again, the 3rd time, when Banerjee, by then Banerjee had been suspended initially from the medical register for a year. He got back on for 1 day, and I reported him again. He was suspended 3 weeks later and then struck off, so he was removed from the medical register, and he was off for 6 years. So he was off for 7 years, bar 3 weeks. But then he remarkably got a national honour for services to patient safety. But he only managed to keep that for 2 months because I complained to the government that this man was a crook. But if you look at the article I wrote about that, you'll see my first reference in the BMJ is to this article that the BMJ won't let you read. So they're prepared to cite it as a reference, but not let you read it. You can still see it, of course, if you've got a paper copy, and if anyone wants the PDF, I can send them one. So that was then, and I've been sued a number of times since for libel, and I was sued by NMT Medical when I was the principal cardiologist in this trial. You'll see, it doesn't really matter what the trial was about, but it was about closing holes in the heart using a device made by NMT Medical. Dr. Dowson and I were co-principal investigators, and the other members of the steering committee were Dr. Mullen, Dr. Muir, and Dr. Nightingale. Dr. Mullen has declared that he's got lecture fees from NMT Medical, the sponsor. He's forgotten to mention that he was also a consultant of the company and owned shares in the company. And so did Dr. Dowson. It slipped his mind. Dr. Dowson has also forgotten to mention, and this was not known to me till some years later, that he'd already appeared before the GMC for falsifying research in an entirely different medical trial. Anyway, we published the data, and if you look at this, you'll see there are 15 authors, but you won't see Dr. Nightingale or my name. Here you'll see that Dr. Mullen has now declared he also was a consultant of the company and had share ownership. Dowson still hasn't. He owns shares in the company. He was paid a significant amount. For the 4 years of the trial, he was paid £2,000 a week, so we're getting on for £400,000. Plus he was paid about £50,000 for recruiting patients, so getting on for £500,000, but it slipped his mind to mention that as a conflict of interest and his share ownership. Dr. Rickard's here. He actually died before the trial started, but he was still an author. He died before the protocol was written, and he's still not only an author of the trial, but he was an author of replies to correspondence 5 years later. But Rickard's was a great chap. I mean, he was the most eminent of these people. Anyway, so, and of course he adds kudos to the paper by being a genuine ghost author. Anyway, Dr. Nightingale and I refused to be named as authors. We were denied full access to the data. Even without it, it was obvious there were errors and omissions in the paper. Nightingale and I had contributed 30% of the patients in the trial. There were clear problems with the efficacy of the device closing the holes. But what's more, another worrying thing was in the paper there was no mention that the device tended to fall out and lie loose in your heart or get carried into blood vessels, into the pulmonary artery, and people had to have procedures to have this removed. It didn't mention that, in fact, large parts of the paper were written by a vice president of the company, and as I said, a lot of conflicts of interest were not disclosed. I spoke about my concerns about this at a big cardiac conference in Washington, and it was published online, and I was sued for the first time out of 4 times by the company for something that was on this US website. I'll just skip that. Well, what did we find? We found the trial did not work. There were meant to be 75 patients in each arm. 74 had the implant, 73 had the sham procedure, and only 3 achieved the primary endpoint in each arm. But it was the company should not have known who any of these patients were, but they somehow found out because patients were identified only by an alphanumeric code. But they found out who these 3 patients were, all 3 of them with an implant who achieved the primary endpoint were patients of doctors who owned shares in the company. The company discovered their identities, and they appeared on rotating banners giving their testimonials for this device. They appeared on the cover of their annual report, inside the annual report. They even appeared here on an NHS website where Dr. Mullen, shareholder in the company, so this Their study indicates that as many 40% of patients could have their migraine symptoms significantly relieved for intervention to close the holes in the heart. That's an NHS website. The trial showed it didn't work. Here's this Zoe Willow again, one of the patients. Dr. Mullen said, "This is significant news for migraine sufferers. This is the first time this study has shown that closing a PFO can have a substantial effect in reducing the symptoms of patients with severe migraine." It didn't work. Anyway, they sued me for 4 years, 4 times rather. It went on 4 years. My costs were £300,000, but I recovered most of it when they went into liquidation, and we got the High Court to sequester money before they went into liquidation. Dr. Dowson, meanwhile, was found guilty for the second time of misconduct in research and suspended from the medical register, and the High Court in London upheld his suspension when he appealed. But they kept his job open at King's College Hospital, and he returned to that. Interestingly, he was on the medical advisory board of a patients group, sort of a patients representative group, Migraine Action, a charity, and he remained on that even while suspended, having been found guilty of research misconduct in 2 migraine trials. So it tells you something about these charities and the sort of people they will employ. So Circulation have published a long correction, a data supplement, new version of the paper, but the correction was by Dowson. It still contains false statements. It doesn't disclose Dowson's conflict of interest. The editor is aware and has not retracted this paper. I wanted just to go on to legal action by employers about employees who. And one of those was Kim Holt, these are people I know well through a whistleblower group. Kim Holt was the first chair of this, and she set it up, and I was the last chair of it, and it's a health service whistleblower group. And after there was a death of a child who was in child protection called Victoria Climbier, after she was killed by her parents, there was an inquiry, and it was decided that they needed to beef up the child support services in Haringey, a part of London, and Great Ormond Street Hospital was asked to develop that. And Kim Holt and 3 colleagues were put into the service to develop it. And they were given no money, and the service, they raised concerns that they weren't able to develop the service and that problems were arising. Her 3 colleagues all resigned. She didn't resign, but was put on paid leave, special leave as we call it in the NHS. You can't go into work. And there was another death, and of a baby called Peter Connolly. In fact, he died the day after social services had told the parents that they would not be prosecuted for having injured him and broken his bones previously, and they were told by social services, "You're not going to be prosecuted." The next day they killed him. And Kim Holt was offered a gagging clause, but turned that down, and she's now employed by a different hospital in London doing the same sort of work, but she's suffered a lot from that. Dr. Z is someone I helped. I can't name her because the High Court says that her identity has to be concealed, but she was a research registrar. She became concerned about misconduct by her boss, who we can call the professor in Cambridge, who I can't name, but when she, in fact, what he was doing was probably illegal under British law. And when she complained to people about this, more senior people, she was immediately suspended, and they kept her suspended for 5 years without pay. They refused to let her leave, and this is the remarkable thing. They could let her not stop her leaving, but they wouldn't pay her, and she was accused of being dishonest, of being mentally ill. She used all her savings, took out loans, had to move to live with her parents again. And the health authority spent $2.5 million on legal fees fighting 42 legal actions when she was fighting against the top QCs in the UK that were employed by the health authority, and she was just representing herself. And in the end, she won, and she got all the money she was owed for the 5 years, but she hadn't worked for 5 years, so life was very difficult. If you're a doctor and you don't work for 5 years and you're a trainee, getting back into it can be very difficult. She had to sign a confidentiality agreement, or she would have been bankrupt for life, really, to get the money. And so that's one reason we can't name her. Jamila Chaudhary was a radiographer who became the radiology manager at Ealing Hospital, and she became concerned that some of the consultant radiologists at her hospital were working in a private hospital in time that they were supposed to be in the NHS hospital. And she went to her line manager, and the immediate response was they had her escorted from the building. She wasn't even allowed to go back to her office. So she complained that people were being dishonest and defrauding the NHS, but because these consultants were more valuable to the hospital than she was, they escorted her from the building. Fortunately, she had a very big handbag, and she had taken all the documents in the handbag because she thought the managers would want to see these. So when they escorted her to the building to stop her going and collecting these, she had them in this big handbag. And she won her case, and the health secretary at the time, Secretary of State for Health, Jeremy Hunt, promised he would get her a job back, but even he could not make the hospital give her a job back, and she remains unemployed, at risk of losing her home. So in summary, the legal protections, there are supposed to be legal protections for those who those who raise concerns, but they're ignored or they fail. The legal power is with wealthy organizations that want to silence whistleblowers. And if they want to get you, they always will, because even if they say that we won't get you for whistleblowing, because of course they can't, they will find something else, something trivial that you've done, because every one of us has made a mistake, and they will trawl from your records. I've had that. People look through your records to see if you made mistakes. People look at if you've rung home from your office, or you've made a private call from the hospital, and little things like that, and they can build up those sort of things to get you, and they always will. Thanks very much.